This is essentially the first half of a book review on What's Our Problem by Tim Urban. And I can't show you a copy because it's only in digital form, at least at the time being. But this was actually a book that I had a very strong positive reaction to the first third and a very strong negative reaction to the last third. So I'm actually going to separate out these videos into those thirds of the book because the first third really is him laying out ideas that I think are very system-level thinking ideas about what's going wrong with our ability to converse across difference. I think he lays out some really helpful ways of thinking about that. And in particular, I've been trying to think about how do we explain the game theory of some of these situations without reverting to the really technical game theory matrices. And I think some of his frameworks for approaching this do a wonderful job of that, so that we actually can build up good mental models about the problems in the world. So I love that. And I do want to build on the models he sets up because I think they're missing some important pieces. But I view this more as building on his ideas rather than critiquing them, even though you could probably view it both ways. That's what I'm doing in this video. Now, this video is not about my critiques of the last third of the book, but I am going to sort of reference that, so I want to at least outline where I'm going with that critique. So the last third is basically the anti-woke argument. That's sort of where it comes from. And my critique more or less amounts to the fact that anti-woke is a tribe. At least I'm going to argue that it is a tribe. And I think in the last third of his book, when he's laying out those arguments, he falls into some of the traps that tribe falls into. So even though there are a lot of things that I agree with him about regarding, the anti-woke perspective and the arguments in their favor, I think the blind spots make his arguments way weaker than they otherwise would have been. And I think his approach actually violates some of the good principles of stuff that he lays out in the first third. So that's where I'm going in the next video, but let's just look at his model. So he has this thing that he calls the ladder, where you've got your higher self up here, your lower self down here. And in his diagrams, he has left versus right on this axis. So let me put that there, even though I want to take it off pretty quickly because I think it's not quite right. Okay, so he has the left-right axis, and he's kind of making the argument that it's not whether you're left or right that matters, it's whether you're higher or lower. So he makes the argument that there's people on the right who are deep thinkers and open-minded, people on the left who are deep thinkers and open-minded, and what you want is these people sort of coming up to the top with their higher selves that are better at having conversation across difference, at open-mindedness, at critical thinking, and that we really want to sort of be up here, and our problem is that we're down here with the lower self. So that's his basic setup. Now, he builds on this setup in some ways I love. But first of all, let me tell you why I don't like the left-right axis here. And that is because the tribes are not just left-right. Like when I look at the landscape of different perspectives that get really entrenched and really reactive when people criticize them, they're not just left-right tribes. Like a lot of them cluster left-right, like under the right, there's sort of clusters where most people in that group will be on the right, and same with the left. But some of those tribes actually cross left-right, including the anti-woke tribe, and that doesn't mean they're not a tribe. So this is really me building on his model. I think I sometimes use left-right as a dichotomy because it's easy, and especially if you're not focused on what are the specific tribes we're talking about. I think this is a good enough first pass at a model. So I'm not critiquing the model here. I'm just saying if you want a more accurate perspective, you're imagining like many, many dimensions. But let me actually talk a little bit more about the higher versus lower, because there's something about that I think he gets a little bit wrong. When he's talking about the higher self versus the lower self, he references some other people. And these are people that I really like their ideas, so I loved that he referenced them. And he accurately acknowledges that his notion of higher and lower is not exactly equal to these. So I think that's good, but I'd like to go back to these people to sort of compare why is this somewhat of a problem. So the two frameworks I will pull from are going to be Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Kahneman. The imperfect analogies here are that Jonathan Haidt has this elephant and this rider analogy where the rider is the logical self, the critical thinking self, the self who can have values that they're trying to impose on the elephant. And the elephant just wants what it wants. It's sort of the carnal self that has these desires and pursues its desires. And of course, this is analogous to Plato's chariot and rider situation. So this is not a new way of distinguishing ideas. And then Kahneman has System 1 and System 2, where System 1 is the automatic thinking, and System 2 is the slow thinking, that sort of critical thinking aspect of people. Now, these two are not exactly the same thing as each other because this one's focused a little bit more on the thinking system and what you think about and the automatic thoughts that arise, as opposed to the elephant is a little bit more about desires, where the elephant has these automatic desires that will bubble up inside you, and the rider has these higher level desires, and the rider can, think through critically and try to impose his will on the elephant who just wants what the elephant wants. But of course, one of the arguments Haidt makes is actually the rider doesn't have as much control as you might think. And the rider can somewhat influence the elephant, but most of the time when the rider is making critical thinking arguments and acting in the world, the rider is really the PR person for the elephant. And I think that's important. So mostly the rider is justifying the elephant's desires. And occasionally the rider can think at a higher level. And one point I would like to make here is that the relationship between the elephant and the rider is this kind of back and forth relationship. And the same thing with the System 1 and the System 2, where the System 2 is the critical thinking part of your brain. And the System 2 can actually try to act on System 1 to counteract System 1's biases. In various ways, by sort of structuring the environment, giving System 1 a bunch of reminders. System 2 can try to overcome the biases and the things System 1 doesn't like about System 2, as can the rider with the elephant. But there is this back and forth relationship between the two that is enmeshed. So now I don't think anything I'm saying would contradict Urban's model, because what I think Urban would say is anything in either two spaces that is a higher version of yourself, so like critical thinking, stopping your biases, generosity, care, all of these good things that are both up here and down here are going to be clustered at the higher level up here. But I do think there is a missing part of this equation, and that has to do with formation. So what is formation? And when you hear this term, you might think of spiritual formation, you might think of meditation. Really, I think of formation as it's your higher self trying to train the lower self to have certain reactions and to not have other reactions. Like it's this part of the elephant and rider diagram, it's this part of the System 1, System 2 diagram, where you can select your own values and try to make sure your elephant is trained in better values. Now, if your reaction at this point is, no way, that sounds religious when you're talking about formation, let me try to convince you that there are good versions of formation as well as bad versions of formation. Because obviously there can be formation that just reinforces biases and causes our elephant to act out more strongly in favor of our own biases against groups that are in our outgroup. That's bad. But there are some positive versions of formation. And the first I'd like to talk about is just education. So I'm an educator, and I don't ignore the emotional aspect of my students, because that's part of forming them into people who can think critically and who can encounter new information with the right elephant. So one thing I want to do in my classes is create experiences where students have a really positive experience from encountering other people who have different values, different backgrounds. I want them to get that dopamine hit from learning from someone who's different from themselves. And that's not necessarily a natural thing that every elephant comes along with. That's more of a learned process that involves formation, where formation is engaging the emotions to act out one's values. In fact, maybe I should just define formation up here. Formation is the writer engaging emotions to act out higher values to train the elephant. That's formation. And there's lots of different types of formation, like 12-step programs where people go through them and they make a list of their character flaws and they share that with someone and sort of look that in the face and come up with ways of being transformed away from some of those character flaws. That's definitely a formation process. Meditation is a formation process where you try to sort of calm your emotions to become more aware of the way your elephant reacts, because that awareness, of course, can be used as a positive tool to stop the elephant from doing things you don't want the elephant to do. Religious formation might involve recognizing that you're prone to gossip and praying about that, meditating on it, and recognizing when you're in a situation where you're tempted to gossip and trying to build up negative feelings toward that gossip to be like, that's not the type of person I am. I want to get out of this situation. If you can train your elephant to be a little bit repulsed by gossip, if that is one of your weaknesses, that would be a type of religious formation. And of course, in his anti-woke section of the book, I think he's talking about some things that people who are pro-social justice, I'm going to use that language rather than the language he uses, but some of those people have certain practices that are almost like spiritual practices for reducing their own racism or their own bias. And of course, he is making analogies to struggle sessions. And I think there are cases where that's actually an apt analogy. Because, like, can you force people into formation? Well, I mean, that would be a whole debate in and of itself. But some of his negative reaction to, say, woke, or SJF is the term he uses in the last section of the book, is really a negative reaction against forced formation sessions that perhaps are not working as well as hoped. Okay, now let's come back to his framework and see how this formation stuff relates to it. So first, let me finish building out his ladder. He has the higher self is the one in control up here, and a very small lower self. And of course, it sort of goes down the chain like this. And I love his people analogies that he gives to sort of explain what someone at each of these levels looks like. At the top layer, you have the scientist who's really just trying to figure out what's true and is not letting the elephant come in and have its way. At the next level down, you have the sports fan who is rooting for one side, but still wants the rules of arbitration to be fair between the two sides. Then down here you have the lawyer, and of course I think this is his analogy with the PR person for the elephant is at this layer. And then down here you have the zealot, the person who is really entrenched in their position and unwilling to consider other viewpoints. And the reason I think it's important to build formation into this model is if you go with his higher versus lower way of thinking about things, and you think about what does it look like to be up here with the scientists. Obviously there's going to be a lot of talk across difference up here. That's great. There's a lot of open-mindedness. There's a lot of people learning from each other. But I think the problem here is that this layer does not do a very good job of training the elephant. Like, you kind of have to go down to the layers where you're sort of protected from all of those arguments against what you're trying to train the elephant to do, to give the elephant sort of the space and the repetition and the grounding and the values you're trying to impose on the elephant. And as a matter of fact, I think what we need up in this space with scientists is people with different elephants. Like people who have different values that are sometimes going to come in conflict with each other. Those people come together in a space where they're open-minded and trying to listen to each other. But I don't think you can get away from the fact that you want those people to go away to their spaces where they're forming certain values that are perhaps more tribal values. And in that sort of tribal space, they come up with the very best arguments against their opponents, and then they bring those arguments back to the scientific space. So if I were to update this model, I would actually use the Jonathan Haidt and Daniel Kahneman framework. For the latter, I would not call it higher or lower. And I would say actually a healthy human being is going to move back and forth between these different layers. And when they show up in the scientific layer, they're going to have a really well-formed elephant. Because the elephants are going to actually determine what kinds of questions the scientists look at. They'll determine where the disagreements happen. The elephants will sort of shape the salience frame of conversations up here. And that's important. So I think it is necessary to go up and down, and you want as much diversity in the types of places you go down to up on this level as possible. That would be my update to the model. Alright, that's probably enough for one video, so I'm actually going to do a second video going through some of the amazing ideas that build on this framework, because he just has a lot of really juicy, wonderful ideas that I'd like to explain. I want people following this channel to understand, and let's do one more video on the good before I switch over to my major critiques of the book.